welcome to yet another episode of Friday Night Chill with Will. I'm Will. Hope you guys have been doing well and having a good week this week. I've been hanging in there for the most part. We'll go into further detail on that a little bit later. But first things first, we ended up getting that haircut on Saturday. So, my little irrational fear thing. I guess let's just dive into that and just kind of talk about that whole experience before we talk about tonight's topic. It ended up going over surprisingly really well, and I don't think I had such a positive experience getting my haircut by a guy like pretty much ever. So I was very impressed. The guy doing it was very communicative during the whole process and was just making sure things were going the way I wanted them to and things were looking the way I wanted them to. And so ultimately, the end result looked really good. I was really happy with it. Styling, we're still kind of getting the hang of it. I haven't had the right products this week. I've been trying to get to the store and get some hairspray. I did that today after work, so after today, it should start looking a little bit better, because right now it's given off kind of oddish pineapple head vibes, and I kind of want to Photoshop this just for fun, but I digress. I'm still digging it. I think it's fun. It's a nice little change. It goes all the way down. It's still like a mullet type of thing, so it's fun. It's a nice change of pace, and we'll see how it looks in the coming months as it grows out and all that. So that was a little update about last week's thing, and I think I was just being sort of doom and gloomy about it because if I did all that, if it turned out decent, I would have been super excited. But the fact that it turned out so well, I was particularly excited about. I will say I had one critique, maybe like one critique of the whole experience. So he did the whole straight edge, thing to like cut down my beard and stuff. That part's fine, cutting down the beard. I totally get that. But what he did that along the edge of my hairline right here, and I'm just not a fan of it because it hasn't even been a week yet, and I already see like a bunch of like little tiny hairs sticking out, and I worry how that's gonna look in a couple weeks when when it grows out a little bit more. So I don't think that step was particularly necessary in the haircut, and luckily it's not too drastic, because I know for some people, more so people with more textured hair than me, they usually get like a whole like half an inch along their hairline sometimes if they have like more like demanding hairstyles or longer hairstyles. But I don't know. I just wasn't a fan of that, so we'll see how that plays out. But regardless, it looks great, and I'm sure it will continue looking great. So tonight I was debating on how I wanted to approach this topic, because it was a topic that's sort of come up a handful of times this week in particular, kind of intentionally and unintentionally, and I'm also going to try and word stuff carefully because I don't want to go into too much detail, but because some of the stuff is kind of personal, but I do want to be transparent and share my experience on what's going on. But tonight I wanted to talk about just sort of letting people make mistakes. And what I mean by that is just kind of not meddling and just letting, because sometimes like people make choices that are very just not good and very detrimental, and it's sort of an obvious thing that like everyone knows except for them. And I've had just a few instances of that this week, and one particular instance this week that just happened yesterday. And I guess we'll just talk about it. So, how do I put this? So, this has to do with my dad, and the relationship between me and my dad has been very weird the past decade or so, but I would say more so the past 8 years, 6 to 8 years. The kind of things were already kind of weird when I came out, because I didn't come out to him, during my 20s. I haven't still technically, and I just didn't feel like they were in a space where they could handle that type of information for me. And so when I came out, I was already kind of like living on my own and was basically financially independent of him and my stepmom. And so I, didn't really feel the need to, I guess, just because I was already kind of like living my life and doing my own thing. And it was just one of those things I kind of put off for a while. And it was just something I put off because I don't know, I just didn't want to deal with it. Probably because me and my dad had a particularly close relationship growing up. I tried really hard to be with him as a kid. And it was kind of to my mom's dismay at times, but because their relationship was a little bit sour for a while. I mean, it's better now, but it was sour for a bit, and it was justifiably so. Now that I'm older and know the context of a lot of that. But me and my dad were probably closer, I would say, than my mom and I were growing up. And so when I started entering young adulthood and realized this thing about myself, like being gay, it was tough not feeling comfortable enough to share that with him, because I felt like it just wouldn't go over well for whatever reason. And like I've always had this weird feeling of like not wanting to disappoint him. Like I always feel like I'm gonna disappoint him. And he's reassured me time and time again, throughout my life and even as an adult, that he's proud of me. And it's good to hear that. But it's hard to hear that when you are sort of hiding a part of yourself from someone. So, that relationship already started getting kind of weird once I entered adulthood. And then Donald Trump became president in 2016. And unfortunately, my dad and stepmom seem to fall down the rabbit hole when it comes to that man and just the alternate reality that he has created and the following that he has created. Somehow they fell into it. Personally, I think it's the church they're involved in, but that could be a whole different podcast topic. But yeah, regardless, they fell down that rabbit hole and have consistently stayed in that rabbit hole since he became president in 2016. And it exacerbated the strain on our relationship even more, because it was a thing where he was getting like not radicalized or anything like that. I don't think my dad was a danger to anyone around him ever, but definitely started getting a skewed perception of what the world is and how it's operating and all that stuff. And it was just one of those things that, like, I guess I just didn't want to deal with it. So it was just kind of a thing that we both ignored. And for a while, it became pretty obvious that, like, we just weren't aligned politically. Like, we didn't even have to really talk about it to know, but we just both kind of could tell. He could probably tell just by the way I reacted to some of the things he would talk about. But that whole thing became a mainstay in our relationship. And so while we were still, we still cared about each other, obviously, there was a bit of distance there now that just wasn't there when I was a kid. And it was weird that it was there as an adult now, but it just was what it was. And I had a feeling that someday, all of those feelings and all of the sort of bending to, like, civility would eventually come to a head, because, like, it just wouldn't be possible anymore. And that day happened. It happened yesterday. So yesterday I get an email from the Department of Education that the Biden-Harris administration have forgiven some student loans I took out when I was 20, and I went to art school for a couple quarters. And the art school I went to was just one of those for-profit colleges that you see on, like, late night Cartoon Network ads. It was one of those type of things, and ended up being a total scam, and all the schools have been shut down since I've gone there. But I found out my student loan for all of the 2 loans that I took out were both getting forgiven. And that was great. I thought it was a bit of a lie that morning. It was a CNBC article that I saw, and I was just like, oh, okay, is this getting my hopes up like the last, student loan forgiveness announcements have been? But ended up being real. Got an email from the Department of Education, and they were like, yep, it's the real deal, and you don't have to do anything except just make sure that your address that we have on file is correct, and you are good to go. If you get any money back, you'll get a check. And it's like, cool. That's awesome. That's like 90% of the debt I owe outside of my car. And so that's great. I'm stoked, I'm super excited about that. And I screenshot the article, sent it to my dad. He just gave like a heart and a thumbs up, So I was like, yeah, cool, that's exciting. I mean, I'm sure he's happy about that, right? And then I sent him a screenshot of the email, and then I sent him that. And, it was the same type of thing. And so this was all while I'm at work. And then he calls me pretty much like right as I'm walking out of work and getting into my car. And, he's like, hey, well, Joe Biden forgave your student loans, it looks like. I'm like, yeah, sure is looking that way. And so he ended up saying something like, well, now that you got that, you can vote for Donald Trump in November. And I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And he was like, really? And I was like, yeah, really. And so I ended up bringing up the trials and stuff, and then he said something along the lines of, that he didn't R-word those women. I want to make sure that the video doesn't get like flagged or something on YouTube if I say words. So he said something along the lines of that, and I was just like, And so this is like the first time this had happened, really, where it's just like political ideologies were like being brought up at all. And, I had mentioned to him, I was just like, I don't like either of these candidates. I don't like Donald Trump. I don't like Joe Biden. Like, they're both awful. But Donald Trump, especially, is awful. And he has made my life harder. And, my dad didn't really seem to understand that. And it ended up escalating a bit more. My stepmom was on the phone as well. It was like a speakerphone conversation type of deal. And, she was trying to de-escalate the whole thing. And, they were trying to just brush it off again. And at this point, I was just kind of tired of, like, this kind of happening. Because, like, my dad had a certain attitude where he was... I asked him, like, oh, did you hear this on, like, Fox News or something? And he got particularly offended about that very quickly. And he, like, said something that, like, oh, you always say stuff like this. And it's like, when have we ever, like, had any kind of conversation like this where, in like, the past, like, 8 years, where any of this would have come up in any capacity? Like, we haven't had those conversations. And, like, I don't know, I don't get why he was getting so upset very quickly, but it was what it was. It ended up kind of just turning into shouting at each other. And I asked them about... somehow January 6th was brought up. And I had never really talked to them about that whole thing, about what happened that day. And I found out that their philosophy on what happened, their idea of what happened on that day, was that the insurrectionists were FBI plants, which that's a new conspiracy theory I've never heard before. I've heard a lot in the years since that happened, but that was definitely a new take that I hadn't heard before. And that kind of was just a moment where I'm just like, oh. So something just kind of flipped in me where it's just like, all right, well, I guess we're doing this because, like, I couldn't even believe what I was hearing, because I was just like, so wow, you both have just been in a completely different world. Like, you guys are just not based in reality right now at all. And that's just sort of a weird revelation to have when you talk to someone. And, ultimately, we kind of, like, shouted at each other a little bit more. And eventually my dad just kind of hung up on me mid-sentence. And that was it. So I ended up, finishing driving home. And kind of decided, all right, well, I need him to know that I'm serious about, like, not putting up with any of this. Like, this is kind of the line that I'm drawing. And I need to make it known now that if this is how he's going to be and this is going to be what he says he believes, then I don't want any part of it. So I blocked his number and my stepmom's number. And, just kind of blocked them on social media so they can't really see my shit. Except for here. I'm sure they'll find it somehow. But yeah, that was yesterday. And, I thought maybe I would feel more sad about it, but at the same time, I can't be too sad about it when it's like a thing I've been expecting for so long. Because I knew eventually, like, something had to give, right? You can't go all this time, like, with a parent and not and not just talk about this stuff. And like when we tried talking just the tiniest bit about it, it just devolved into a shouting match almost immediately, because it was just like, it was so blatantly obvious that just we were not in the same place. And, even knowing all of that didn't make it any less disappointing when it was all just kind of like confirmed for me in that moment. And, I started thinking about it after it happened and like all that stuff. And, I started thinking about like the decision to like just kind of cut them off and just be like, you need to figure it out. It just kind of reminded me of other times in my life where I used to be kind of the meddler as a young adult, in my 20s. I definitely tried to fix situations way more than I should have, more specifically with friends. That was kind of my forte, was like trying to make amends and trying to make sure everything was going great in friend groups, regardless of what was going on. And the concept I didn't really understand was that, sometimes people are just going to do stuff and you just have no control of it, and you just need to accept that. And, I learned that lesson pretty harshly with an old friend of mine. It was like her birthday, and it was a whole thing. We had a whole like little falling out. That could be a whole other story time. That's a whole different thing. But, I remember her yelling at me that night to just be like, well, let me make my own mistakes. You gotta let me make my own mistakes. And, thinking about that all these years later, I was just like, after that night, I just had to be like, yeah, you're right. I do have to let you make your own mistakes. Because for some things in life, it's just the only way you learn is just by living those experiences and just kind of having the hindsight, after the fact. I've been in questionable relationships with people, and it wasn't until like afterwards people were like, oh yeah, that whole situation was kind of weird, wasn't it? And it was just like, it's one of those things where I like look back on them and I'm just like, yeah, it was weird. Why didn't you say anything? And then like they're just like, well, I mean, we just kind of had to let it happen. And I used to not understand that, but now that now that I'm a little bit older, I'm just like, yeah, you kind of do just have to let it happen sometimes, because intervening can just kind of unnecessarily draw out more animosity, because you're not looking at it with clear enough eyes. You're not looking at the situation with clear enough eyes to realize that in the moment, you're kind of in a bad place. And so it isn't until you have those hard moments end or whatever, or a big moment happens and something causes you to have some moment of reflection where you're just like, oh, wow, yeah, that whole thing was weird. Why did I do that? And I mean, that's good, because if you're able to do that, it means you're growing and means you're learning. But I feel like those are things that happen all throughout your life. It's not just specific times in your life, and it happens in different ways. And so, when I think about this whole situation that happened with my dad this week, thinking about how situations like this have happened to me in the past, I just kind of came to the conclusion that this was a learning moment for him, ideally, for him and my stepmom. I don't know exactly how it will play out, obviously, but I am hopeful that this is the catalyst to bring about the change that he has needed in his life. And, like, if he ever wants to have any kind of meaningful relationship with me ever again, he needs to go through this. And it sucks. I'm still upset about it. But I know it needs to happen. And that's what's been hard. Is just knowing this needs to happen and knowing there's nothing I can do. Because he's not in a place where he wants to listen. Because like I said, like, it was less than a minute. Within a minute, we were like shouting at each other on the phone, and that's like never happened. So it I don't know. It's just indicative of, I think, how far into this stupid cult that they've fallen into. And I really tried thinking about, like, because I'm sure there's so many people that have this experience, this specific experience with, like, Trump supporters in your family. And, like, I've seen stuff where, like, people, like, touch on it and stuff, and, like, how the holidays can get kind of awkward, and, like, you kind of just have to dance around politics now because of this fucking idiot who managed to become president, completely changing the way we talk about politics in America, and just kind of in the world. Like, him becoming president was, like, one of the worst things that probably could have ever happened, but especially in hindsight, because I don't know, man, you think about how politics behaved before he got into office, and it wasn't until he was there that we saw civility just sort of disappear, and the whole concept of politics became more about ego and a bunch of random fucks being racist and, like, shouting off the most noteworthy thing so that way they could go viral and, like, kind of just further their own career. And it's just wild, like, the repercussions of all of that, because it's definitely affected so many families and so many people's relationships, and there's been so many casualties, I'm sure, because of that. I'm hoping our relationship isn't another one, but I also have to be prepared for it to be. But I don't know. That was I don't know. Like, I'm not, like, I'm sad. Obviously, I'm sad about the whole thing, but I'm not like, I'm gonna cry about it sad. I'm just like, it's disappointment is what it is, because it's just like, I don't know. It's just like, it's such obvious bullshit. Like, with anything with that man, at least to me, to me and so many other people, it's just like, everything that man does is such obvious bullshit. It's so obvious he's a grifter. It's so obvious that he's a crook. It's so obvious that he doesn't give a fuck about anyone besides himself. It's just so obvious. All of that stuff is. And it's just crazy to see so many people identify with this man, who just does not have any good qualities about him, because he's not good at anything. So when it comes to this whole situation, it's gonna be another one of those things where I have to let my dad and my stepmom make this mistake. They've been making the mistake for a long time, but they need to make the mistake of, like, being willing to stop talking to me for a bit, so that way they can hopefully reflect on what the fuck is going on in their life and why things are the way they are, and hopefully we can resolve this at some point. I'll probably unblock their numbers at some point, but I am definitely going to wait a while before I do it, because I don't want to deal with it right away. And also, I want to make sure I give them enough time, because, I don't need them trying to do a thing where it's like, a couple weeks go by and then they like try and call and patch things up. It's like I also had to stand my ground and just be very serious about how much this means to me. That like, listen, we don't have to ever talk ever again. Like, that's how serious I am about this. And if you want to choose the orange clown over your son, then go for it. But I'm not gonna force you. The choice seems obvious to me. Again, it's another thing that seems obvious to me, but I'm waiting on them to realize what the decision is, that they have to make. If you guys have had this experience, specifically with like, politics coming to a head like this, because I'm certain I am not the only one. And if you guys feel comfortable sharing any of those experiences, I would like to read them in the comments of this episode on YouTube. I would appreciate that. It is kind of difficult trying to navigate this right now. I don't know anyone too particularly that has exactly this experience, but people have been telling me that they know people who have gone through something similar. So if you have a similar experience, I would love to read about it and just like how you guys are coping with it, because there is a sense of feeling lost at the moment. But that's just kind of where I'm at. But yeah, if you have those experiences, leave them down below. If you are new to the channel and this is your first time watching an episode, hello. I hope you enjoyed. If you like the episode and you're on YouTube, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. We put out new videos or new episodes on Fridays, so you can check back in for another weird topic. Who knows what we're talking about next week. And if you'd like to keep up with me on various other social media platforms, I'm at Willie J. Co. pretty much everywhere on the internet. And if you are trying to listen to this on other platforms, check out Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're listening on those platforms already, rate and review the podcast. That would be appreciated as well. I mixed up that outro. That got a little weird, but it's fine. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, you guys, and listening to my story tonight. And I will see you all next week for another Friday Night Chill.